Right, we're very close to finishing the day, except for the dinner and reception. But let's wrap up with the distilled words of wisdom from our 3 round tables. So the first round table, A, was on government capacity for resource management. Monica is the rapporteur.
I am.
Yeah.
So we had actually a pretty beefy discussion and raised lots and lots of different issues, but of course my job is to squeeze it down to 3 points. So I'm going to actually squeeze it down to 4 with one that's sort of the overriding, which in the United States, one of the favorite mantras during a political campaign is, "It's the economy, stupid." But I think when it comes to this resource management, through the whole day, a lot of the conversation was about the politics surrounding it. And so I would say that one of the things that many of these governments who have institutions that haven't been challenged or they're not even in place, we talked about countries, Norway, for instance, which actually was quite healthy when oil, in terms of the politics, oil was discovered, versus South Sudan. We had a fabulous conversation about South Sudan. And so the overriding theme, I think, of our conversation, I don't know how our fellow roundtablers feel, but it's politics, stupid. And so governments really need to get out in front and display leadership, effective communication, and explain how they're going to steward these resources, not only in the short term, which in one of the things that we talked about is the short term is 5 years, right? We heard from Rio Tinto. It can take 6 years for the extraction of these resources, and the government needs to get out in front on that. And there was sort of agreement, I think, that some of the government capacities could be outsourced and should be outsourced right away, and that's the technical expertise, and to some extent the legal and economic expertise. But when working with the corporations and with these experts, there was really a sense that you need to develop the local capacity for the longer term. And in particular, as the corporations come in, local capacity and infrastructure, and thinking about multi-users and multi-function, so electricity, water, schools, medical services, and that sort of thing. And then the last is building political commitment technologies, which is Paul's term, thinking about how to tie the hands of future governments, and also tying the hands of the corporations to abide by their commitments. And we heard this morning Ngozi talking about how the non-reformers, the opponents to reform, and so the question is how do you get them, how do you tie so that populist sort of rhetoric and then populist policies don't come into place? So building political commitment strategies so that future governments actually abide by the terms of the narrative and the policies associated with that narrative to ensure that the resources that come online are actually used wisely and effectively for future generations.
Thanks, Monica.
You're welcome.
Let's turn to Christine Cheng, who's rapporteur for panel B, which was global initiatives to strengthen resource management.
So we discussed a number of global initiatives like EITI, the Voluntary Principles on Human Rights, the Kimberley Process, the Natural Resource Charter, the Open Government Partnership. And we came to, we discussed some of these strengths and weaknesses, and we came to a few kind of broad ideas and principles about what would constitute a good global initiative. So we have here a list of some basic things that we should be thinking about in designing global initiatives, that the goals should be achievable and realistic, that the initiative itself should be focused, that it should be able to send a signal to the international community, that there's a critical mass of countries that can participate, that there's a compliance structure and enforcement mechanisms that are put in place, that the initiative itself should be able to adapt, that the body itself should be able to sustain its political power over time, that it should be multi-stakeholder, and that it should be truly global and not just led by the global north. So those were the basic principles that we came up with. A few also very interesting points that came up about global initiatives. One is that there's been a lot of discussion around transparency, but it was raised in our discussion that transparency is a necessary but not sufficient condition for good management of natural resources. And I think people who work on this know that, but I think more broadly it can't be perceived as just a panacea for how to deal with natural resource management. Another point that was raised was about this process of going from a norms-based kind of, a rules-based or a norms-based initiative, and then shifting from that to something harder, to moving towards it being written into law, and how that process takes place. That is a difficult process to go. And we were talking about how one thing that was raised in the discussion is that the process itself is actually really critical, that there are unintended consequences that come out of having a process, that the norms will actually create a forum. So we were talking about EITI specifically, and how there was a lot of unintentional peer learning that took place as a result of having the forum itself, which was unexpected, but turned out to be quite valuable for the people who were at the table. And importantly, out of that, also we discussed peer learning and how that peer learning is basically taking place on an ad hoc basis right now. Yeah. But it could be either more formalized, or there could be more of it, or there could be a way in which to standardize it. But there are basically other forms of peer learning, south-south learning, as opposed to north-south learning. And that was basically our discussion.
Thank you. I mean, recall that the former Minister for Mining in Mongolia said the most useful technical assistance was when the former Finance Minister of Chile came in. So this was sort of south-south. Let's turn to Roundtable C, which is about sustainability. Tom Hale.
So our roundtable began by first asking what sustainability really meant. Probably lots of us came there with some assumptions about what that meant, but Caroline very helpfully started us off by making us think about it in 3 different ways. First way was economic sustainability. How can we make natural resources not this flash in the pan for growth, but rather part of a long-term growth strategy? The second way was social stability. How can we make sure that natural resource extraction is compatible with the kinds of societies and jobs that we want to have? And the last one is the one that probably most of us assumed it was about, which was environmental sustainability. How can we have natural resource extraction that's compatible with the world in which we actually want to live? And those 3 things, economic, social, and environmental sustainability, are of course the sort of core pillars of the sustainable development framework. So we started off with, again, a beautiful theory, a theory that makes eminent sense, and we were left instead with the challenge of how to put that into practice and how governments should put that into practice. And of course, that's no easy thing. We then focused on a few what we might call technical solutions, to go back to Paul's point about the technical versus political kinds of solutions. Transparency was also one that we talked about a lot. Chuck Mason had an interesting story about Wyoming, where he's from, where a lot of hydraulic fracturing or fracking takes place. Companies inject a mix of chemicals and water into rock, crack it open, and take the gas and oil that comes out of that. And until very recently, the companies didn't have to say what that cocktail of chemicals they injected into the earth was. No one knew. It could be anything, really. The law was changed. Now they have to publish. No regulation on what is required or not required. Just have to say what you put into the earth. And lo and behold, the mix of chemicals was changed quite substantially. So transparency is certainly not sufficient, but there are cases where just a little bit more transparency actually can have quite easy policy dividends and whatnot. The second technical solution was dealing with uncertainty. We had a lot of questions that dealt with the problem. How do you actually know what the sustainability impacts of your natural resources will be? It seems like we're always reacting to the last crisis instead of preventing the first one. And the case of the Gulf of Mexico oil spill with BP was mentioned. The Hurricane Sandy preparations were mentioned. So both on the sort of non-polluting of extraction side and the sort of adaptation to changing climate issues, it seems like we need better capacity to have better ideas for risk management on that side. And that was the third technical solution, which was the capacity issue. Coming back to the first topic of the panel, how can we equip governments to actually tackle these questions when they require deep scientific expertise, technical solutions, money, things that are not always in great supply. Let me just close by saying these technical solutions ultimately don't answer our question that we posed at the beginning, this tripartite mix of environmental, social, and economic sustainability ultimately needs a bigger solution to that. A sustainable world is not one we'll get from transparency or better risk management. We need to think quite seriously about how to change the kinds of resources we rely on. There's a negotiation going on as we speak in Doha over climate change. It's the 18th negotiation, where 190-something countries have gotten together, and it ends tomorrow, and I will buy anyone here who wants to take a wager a cup of coffee, a bottle of beer, something, that there will not be an outcome tomorrow. And this is a problem. This is going to affect our ability to have economic sustainability in the long term, to have social sustainability in the long term, and of course environmental sustainability in the long term. Let me just close by saying Minister Zort had one little note of hope here. Do you remember his 100,000 Suns program? Mm-hmm. Here's a great renewable energy program that's being funded by coal extraction. So it's linking the political incentives of those who want to take resources out unsustainably with the incentives of using more renewable technology. And that kind of political jujitsu, if you will, taking opposing incentives and aligning them is probably the kinds of solutions we need to think about.
Thanks very much, everybody. So our theme is galvanizing growth, how government can galvanize growth. On no aspect of growth is government so important as natural resource management. And just let me close by illustrating that. The same resource that made Botswana the richest country in Africa, diamonds, made Sierra Leone the poorest. The same resource, oil, that made that made Norway the richest country in Europe, produced Nigeria. And so the range between good and bad isn't a function of the resource, it's a function of policy management of that resource. It's the economic, technical, political decisions for management. And that the range of outcomes is so extraordinarily extreme that that's why it really is legitimate to say, if you're worrying about growth, this is the place to start. Because differences in policy have such hugely geared consequences. Now, that's enough for today. We have a reception in Exeter College at 7 o'clock, I think, followed by dinner in Exeter College. And Exeter's a beautiful old college. I'm not from there, so I can say, go snoop around.
I am.
Ah!
I was from there. And if you have the chance, make sure and also for those of you who are Philip Pullman fans, Exeter is the home of that particular series of books. But also there is a back garden. Go to the back garden and you will have one of the most beautiful views over Oxford that you can find. You'll see the Bodleian on one side, the Radcliffe Camera, and the colleges, and it's just a stunning view. But you have to, it's not obvious from the front quad. You'll have to go through to the back and walk past the lawn and then up these magic stairs and over the back, and you will see that view.
It really is the best view in Oxford. It's the best view in Oxford, so I recommend it. Yeah. Thank you very much.